You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Sacred Sofa listeners, the fall season is not too far away, and we are excited to let you know that we will be back with new episodes starting on Thursday, September 12th. In the meantime, we are airing previously recorded episodes prior to launching the Sacred Sofa.
This morning, we are looking at attention for many people. What are people of faith to make of all the references to hell in Scripture? So, this is an episode called Hell and How to Get There. Enjoy. This week, we are taking on the question, is God angry? That's what my sermon was about, and we're going to dive into all sorts of different things this morning with this. I'm excited to get at it. To start, the question, of course, is God angry? I think a lot of us grew up with a notion that God has wrath and is angry. Of course, there's that famous sermon by Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and I think that's filled our collective imagination with this thought of an angry deity. And when you go to Scripture, it is not hard at all to find passages that would support the idea of an angry God. They're all over the place, so it's not hard to find proof, if you will, that God might be angry with us. But we jumped in and sort of started looking at the way metaphor operates. And that was the sort of big takeaway from the sermon is, I guess, that there's many ways to talk about God. We're forced to use metaphor because God is the ground of being. It's impossible to capture God accurately in language. And so we use all sorts of metaphors. Some are more helpful than others. You know, God can be seen as a father, a mother, a warrior, a rock, a tower. You know, there's plenty of metaphor imagery used in Scripture about God. And my hypothesis, I suppose, was that anger is, again, another way of metaphorically speaking about God and about a certain experience we have in life that we might call falling under the wrath of God. But to say that God is literally angry with us would be inaccurate. So that's sort of the premise there, but I'd love to dive into a whole slew of things around anger itself. But maybe I'll throw it over to you to speak to maybe the idea of metaphor a bit and how that can trap us up maybe in our heads sometimes.
You know, God is infinite and we are finite. And so the use of metaphor is riddled through the Hebrew scriptures to help us understand to some degree, as best as we can, concepts about God. And, you know, one of Jesus's plans was to help us see God more clearly through the divine and human experience. And I think there's a lot to be said from that. Right off the bat, what comes up to me, and please pick up on this, is, you know, Jesus' anger in the temple. You know, and I believe one of the reasons Jesus became incredibly angry, and I actually like the imagery of Jesus being angry because it's real, and it's real to something we can resonate with. But I believe Jesus was so angry because the people in the temple were interrupting people's ability to see God for who they really are. And, you know, Jesus had a lot to say about Pharisees and Sadducees and those folk tax collectors and folks who oppress people. And so their anger is useful. So let's talk about anger in metaphorical terms. I actually do quite a bit of work with anger, the emotion of anger with clients, and I do use a metaphor. It's called the anger iceberg. And so as an honorary Newfoundlander, I've been to Newfoundland quite a few times and have the amazing and fascinating experience of seeing icebergs up close. Well, as close as one can safely.
Right, safely, yes.
Safely. majestic events in nature. And what we now know about icebergs is that 10 to 20% of what we see of an iceberg is at the top. And we use that analogy, tip of the iceberg. And 80 to 90% of the mass is actually underwater. And so what took out the Titanic was what they couldn't see. It wasn't what they saw, it's what they couldn't see. And now, of course, we have technology that can help with those things. But when I'm looking at that iceberg, and some of the tip of the icebergs are taller than houses, we're talking about massive structures. So imagine how much is underneath the surface, and that's why they can be incredibly dangerous. So translating that same metaphor to anger, anger is an emotion like any other: joy, sadness, excitement. But the tip of the anger iceberg, what we experience on the top, is actually pointing to emotions underneath the surface. So anger is an emotion like any other. It's neutral. They just are. And anger is what we call a secondary emotion because it's pointing to primary emotions underneath the surface. And those primary emotions, when not dealt with, will push anger further and further to the top. And many people feel the unhealthy effects of anger out the top. The other metaphor I like to combine with this metaphor is fire. So I have a really nice fire pit in the back. I enjoy sitting by the fire. I enjoy s'mores by the fire, Brad.
Yes.
But that fire is in a container, in a containment. With that fire out of containment, it will absolutely destroy my deck, if left unchecked, my house, right? Fire is not the problem. It's fire unleashed or unharnessed in a healthy way. And in the same way, anger is a useful emotion. It belongs to us to highlight for us something's wrong. There's a boundary violation that's taken place, an injustice. But what we do with the anger is whether it's helpful or harmful. Anger unharnessed, anger uncontained will absolutely destroy. And so that's the use of metaphors that I use, especially around this healthy, God-given emotion called anger. And I think there's a lot we can use as we explore this text, even with that metaphor in mind and God's character in mind. God doesn't just lay waste to humanity. And we talked in our previous episode about belief systems. We have to understand there was a cultural understanding at the time of this text that was written. Folks were used to gods, little g, who were petty and fickle and would just lay waste to humanity in these mythology and things like that. And so there's a belief system here, I think, that is underlying the text and even our interpretation of the text.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness, there's a lot to go on there. So, but let me jump on what you said at the end there. I think you look at ancient religion, pre-scientific understanding. There's you have a situation where it's like, oh my goodness, there's a drought, there's been no rain. So my experience is directly tied to how I picture the deity's emotional state. Something isn't going well here. Therefore, that must mean the gods are angry or upset. And so there's a lot of that, I think, going on. But I do think the metaphor, the wrath of God, is describing a human experience, but giving language to God that today I don't think is helpful. And one of the things I maybe failed to drive home maybe in my sermon is that a metaphor that's no longer working for us can be let go. If you have an abusive parent, understanding God as parent may not be the right metaphor for you to talk about God. Fair enough. I think it's the same today. I think what scripture, I like how Brian Zahn says it. The wrath of God is is divine consent to our self-destructive rebellion against God, or I would say against the grain of love in the world. And sometimes there's natural consequences to what we do. And if we're acting out of character, going against the grain of love, there's going to be experiences we have in life. Now, you can call that maybe a certain element of karma. Maybe you could call that, just action consequence. I think an ancient understanding would be like God's angry. I've stepped out of the realm of love, and that has incited wrath from God, and therefore I'm out of sync with my family or whatever. So I think it's describing a real human experience. I think the dangerous part is when we put that back on God. Mm-hmm. God is angry and is smiting me here. So I wanted to make that clear from my end, that I think that's what's going on. Language trying to explain a real human experience. But when you talk about anger, I think for me, in reflecting on this, one of the reasons that wrath of God, anger of God language scares us is because our own personal anger scares us as well. I think for me, in reflecting on it, of any of the emotions that I feel, I think anger is the one that scares me most. I can feel out of control. It can be as simple as a sports game and being angry, right? And feeling like you're losing your mind. I mean, emotions do different things to us, but of all of them, anger can be the scariest, or the one, I like your fire imagery, that feels closest to spilling over, out of the boundaries where they need to be. And that can happen with any emotion. If I'm in grief, right? And, I don't want to, start crying in the middle of a meeting or something like that. Right. So that can happen. But anger to me is, I think, one of the scarier ones, because it's just so loaded with passion. So what is going on then, underneath the surface when you talk about the iceberg? And you said anger is really being pushed up by other emotions and experience. Can you tell us more about what's happening under the surface?
Absolutely. So are you okay to be my guinea pig in this?
Yeah, of course. Yes, exactly.
So what I'd like you to do, and this is work that I do with clients, what I'd like you to do, Brad, is think of a most recent incident where you became angry.
Okay.
You got that incident in your mind?
Yeah, I got it in my head.
Why don't you summarize what happened, the scenario?
Okay, I'll give this to the most recent one. My dog was chewing on my prescription sunglasses. Okay. Does that work for you, or do you want me to come up with a human one?
Well, no, this is good. We'll start with the canine.
Okay, we'll start with the canine.
Start with the canine.
Yes.
So anger is a secondary emotion. So when you came upon the scene, dog chomping on something, and then noticed it was your prescription sunglasses, which as one who wears spectacles, these are not inexpensive.
No, yes.
So I want to take you back to that moment and see if you can identify what emotions were also happening. So you've come across the scene. Anger is what you expressed, but what emotions might have been also influencing the anger?
I don't know if it's an emotion per se. How would you loss? The immediate thing, loss on a number of levels. Loss of money, loss of, what's the word? A certain, okay, well, now what am I going to do when it's sunny out, right? Confusion, a feeling of waste. Oh my goodness, that's money wasted. Lack of control.
Yes, absolutely. Powerlessness.
Yes. Right there. Yeah.
And I suspect if we go deeper, there are probably other emotions that were happening leading up to this event. So were there other things happening that caused you some emotional upset prior to this event?
Well, this was early in the morning, so that's not good.
Tired?
Very tired, not at my best self early in the morning. This is what I woke up to. For one of the first things I encountered that morning was, so I hadn't had my coffee. I hadn't, there's maybe a bit hungry, tired, lots of elements going on there.
So you identified confusion, loss, fear, worry. What am I going to do when the sun comes out? I need these sunglasses. You experienced tired. Like, each of those emotions were not addressed. Anger erupted out of the top. And so one of the work to do is self-awareness. And we talked in a previous episode about that halted concept. Am I hungry, angry, lonely, tired, excited, drunk, or drugged? Anything that upsets emotionally, if we don't deal with it, it's gonna erupt. Daniel Gottman, I mentioned him in a previous episode as well, says if we have internal conflict that's unaddressed, it's going to erupt into external conflict. And you had some things going internally. You come upon this scene, and even the canine took the brunt of what was happening for you internally.
Well, and it's interesting because there's so, even as you're talking about it, there's so many layers, right? I've always been had some misgivings about us having a pet. So that's playing it there. Then there was some ego stuff. Okay, these glasses look salvageable, but do I want to wear around a pair of sunglasses that look all chewed up? So there's some image stuff going on there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of things at work.
And Brad, in a nanosecond, right? This is you and I, weeks after this event, unpacking, going down layer upon layer, right?
Yes.
And you're coming to more self-realization of what else was impacting this. And to the degree that that internal conflict, those other things, those other boundary violations, is probably not the first time the dog has chewed on something that belongs to you. All of these add up to this explosion. And so, anger is an emotion, boundary violation. Dog has taken something that belongs to me and is destroying it. That's the use of that anger, say, this is not okay. The goal here is to recognize the emotion and then harness it and express it in a healthy way.
No, okay. I'm just trying to parse why anger scares me so much, because again, you're talking about a nanosecond thing, right? So it's hard to, it's stimulus plus instant reaction, or feels instant. And I think in terms of emotions, when you look at some of the other primary emotions, they're going to spill out as well too, right? But they feel less loaded than anger. Anger can really, I'm trying to think of, if I'm disgusted, maybe there's a gag reflex. Okay. That doesn't seem to harm anyone. Sadness, maybe I start crying. But with anger, you can go to the extreme where there's maybe violence involved, but even just, a harsh word, a tone of voice, like those things can be cutting to other people very quickly in a way that I feel like the expression of other emotions maybe isn't. So that makes it feel, loaded.
I would agree. And I believe it's because there's been so many examples, personal and otherwise, where anger has not been harnessed in a healthy way. I mean, we're talking current events right now. Current events. Behind every confrontation or conflict, there is a boundary violation. And on a grander scale in terms of current events, there's been boundary violation after boundary violation, and people's anger, as well as pain, suffering, grief, loss, you use that emotion, and so many other things, fear, terror, all of those unaddressed often erupt into anger, because anger is that emotion that actually, to your point, feels powerful. Right? It engages us to action, but we get to choose what type of action, with self-awareness, with time, with intention. And now, so to your point, yes, it does feel very scary.
Yeah. Now let's unpack a couple things here, because you already mentioned Jesus, at least that one incident where he becomes angry. And then I also mentioned in my sermon, Jesus reading from the prophet Isaiah, when he talks about what people were waiting for. And again, it's really hard not to read contemporary times into some of this stuff, but the idea that he shows up to proclaim good news to the poor, sight to the blind, on and on it goes. But what he leaves out is vengeance. And anytime, of course, in Jesus' day, Israel was oppressed under Rome. They were, the boot heel of Rome on the Jewish people's neck. And the one thing that Jesus seems to refuse to do is to use the anger of their situation to enact vengeance. And even I'm intrigued because the story of Jesus being angry, there is some physical stuff going on there. He gets a whip out. He doesn't hit anyone, but he gets a whip out. He turns over tables. Like, I mean, it is pretty raw what we're seeing here from Jesus expressing anger.
And, you know, I haven't done enough reflection to say, would I identify this as an unhealthy expression of anger? Not really sure. Like destruction of property, you know, in today's society, that would be domestic mischief, perchance, you know. I'm sure there's some Canadian criminal codes we can, you know, infuse into the text. And so I think I would have to, just on the top of my head, I think I would have to say there are unhealthy expressions of anger that Jesus, turning over tables, destroying property, you know, taking a weapon, because that's what that was, a weapon. But we also have to remember that Jesus, and this is a mystery, Jesus was God and fully human, fully God and fully human. And so the human expression of himself turned over tables and the whip. The emotion is real. The justice, the righteous anger is legitimate. How Jesus expressed it, I think we'd have to say was an unhealthy expression of anger, which almost sounds sacrilegious, but we gotta be true.
No, and you know, it's interesting. I once heard somebody say, this was helpful for me, about the temple table incident. What did they say? Not everything Jesus did we should attempt. And it was like, okay, you know, you don't want to let Jesus off the hook necessarily, but it's like, okay, maybe there's some things he could express in this divine human that maybe we should tread carefully with. But even on one of the things I like doing is chopping wood, or I think you see this even when people work out. Sometimes anger needs a release valve,
a physical expression. Absolutely.
Yes. And trying to bottle it, maybe there's something unhealthy about that too. I think it's interesting that Jesus never harms, he never hits anyone, but there is a physical expression. It's like, this is palpable, and if this doesn't find a release form, it might actually end up being worse. I don't know.
And there's things we can take away from that as well. I recently read an article about 10 different ways to express anger physically. And so working out was in there, going for a walk, jogging, running, this is a newer trend, those rage rooms where people can go in and smash things. Like, you know, when we think about the stress hormone that builds in our body, which is what happens to us physically when we're upset, it does need, as you say, a release valve. And so the key here is not only being aware that I have this very powerful emotion happening, how do I release it in a way that doesn't destroy myself or destroy others? Suppression would be destroying self. But raging uncontrollably, fire unharnessed, that's not going to be helpful for anyone. And so there's ways.
I mean, it almost seems like the raging uncontrolled is the suppression to the point of explosion, right? Like, if it doesn't find the release valve, it will find its way out, but maybe not in the way you want it to. It's interesting because I remember doing a sermon a while back. It was on Nelson Mandela's workout routine while in prison, and one of the things he talked about was having to move his body to, I think his routine was wild, like 200 like sit-ups a day or something like that. I can't remember offhand, but this need to move the body to release anger. And again, it's easy maybe pointing out with other emotions what that looks like. Sadness, maybe the release is you need a good cry, or, you know, disgust, well, hey, just stay away from, you know, that food, whatever it is. But anger, it has to be channeled carefully, or it can become destructive.
And to the counterbalance, expressed constructively, or it would destroy self and others, because sometimes anger can look like expressed outwardly can look like substance use and abuse, for example. But just as damaging is suppression of anger, which, if anger is not expressed in a healthy way, it can be internalized, which we now know can lead to depression,
Oh,
We
interesting.
now know that anger stuck inside of us can lead to mental health considerations as well as physical ailments. And
Huh.
so emotions are powerful. They're neutral, but what we do with them is whether they're going to be helpful or harmful to ourselves and others.
Mhm. Do you have, for clients you work with, any sort of anger boundaries, fair fight, conflict stuff? Is there a way to sort of say definitively this is a healthy way to express anger? This is not. Now, I mean, violence is obviously, in my mind, one that's never appropriate. But is
Correct.
there, for instance, I'll give you, in my family of origin, we tend to express our anger loudly. So, their debate or something, raise voices. Now that's, maybe that's a bit of the Scottish in me too. I don't know, but like, and that's something I've had to, with kids, with Kristen, is, that's not always a healthy expression to be like, the winner is who talks loudest.
Right, right.
So are there ways to think about how to be healthy in expressing anger?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because in my home of origin, I call it Cold War.
Oh, okay.
I can count on one hand how many times anger came out hot. It
Oh.
was this cold, insidious, Adele song, the icy cold shoulder. Like you knew something was wrong, but
Mm,
nobody was talking about it.
mm,
Nobody was talking about it. And which we now know is just as harmful. Children, folks are impacted by that sense of tension, even if they're not witnessing anything overtly
mm,
violent or abusive. And so, the self-awareness is the first part. How do I manage my emotions or harness my emotions healthily in a healthy way is self-awareness.
mm,
I got to know that I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And so one of the first things I do with clients is start to help them identify where they're feeling the emotion in their body. What does it sound like in their head?
mm.
And this is a mindfulness exercise, starting to pay attention to what's happening in my body. Where do I feel that tension? Clients will say, well, I start to feel hot, my face feels flushed, or I feel a tightness in my chest. Those are indicators that something is going on.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, I often use this metaphor too, and like Incredible Hulk doesn't just turn green instantly.
Hmm.
If you're a,
Yes.
a superhero fan, there's
Yeah.
a lead up to
Mhm.
the Green Man. And so, how do you start to identify your lead up before you turn green? And so
Mm.
that's the work that I do with clients and have them practice that. What does it sound like in my head? Well, you're just doing this on purpose, stupid dog. This belongs to me. Like there's a dialogue going in our head that's going to help
Right.
talk us up or it's going to talk us down. And
Mhm.
so self-awareness is key. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me ask you a question then. There's a famous proverb that says, "Let not the sun go down upon your wrath," something like that. I might be,
Mm-hmm.
the idea is don't go to bed angry, or,
That's our
you know,
translation of it.
yes, yes. I'm curious though, because there have been times where it has felt to me, going, hey, particularly, I'll just talk about my marriage, right? Like, hey, there's conflict here. We're both upset, but let's not go to bed angry. And sometimes I have wondered if that is actually not so helpful. And there's even been times with Kristen where I've said, you know what, I just need to go for a walk because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right now I feel like I'm kind of in, I almost want conflict mode. I don't think I'm actually
Mm-hmm.
looking for
Resolution.
resolution here. It's like sometimes you want to pick a fight, sort of thing. Is there a way that maybe we've been misguided about is anger sometimes maybe too hot that you got to just let it simmer before you can deal with it? Or I don't know.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. You know, our interpretation of don't let the sun go down on your anger, it could actually in practicality look like, you know what? I can see that we're on opposite sides of this issue. Going around and around is not going to be helpful. Can we table this? Let's just table
Mm,
it for the night and then we'll try again tomorrow when neither
mm,
party is tired. Going back to that halted.
right.
you're not letting the sun go down on your anger because you're creating an intention with which to deal with the issue, but not in a way that's going to ultimately destroy both parties.
Right. Oh, that's good.
And many people actually, Brad, end up in more conflict because they have this belief. I'm not supposed to go to bed angry, so we got to hash it out now. We're going to keep going and going and going and going. And it absolutely can destroy relationships. Absolutely.
That's good to know. And I like that idea of it's not letting the anger go. It's tabling it for maybe when, so it's almost like a hot soup, right? Ooh, that's too hot. You're going to burn your tongue if you try to eat that right now. Let it cool down a little bit, and then you can come at it. And it's amazing sometimes what a night of sleep can do.
Yes.
It really can be helpful. Yeah.
And, we have so many belief systems in society that kind of influence sometimes how we respond to our emotions, dealing with things now. Sometimes it feels urgent, but most time it's not. If it's urgent to the point you need assistance, then you're calling 911. It take a moment or two or three, and both parties agreeing to come back to the issue. You're not going to just sweep it under the rug, to use another metaphor. You're both agreeing to come back when you're both at capacity to address whatever the issue might be.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Yeah, I keep thinking of tempest in a teapot, and sometimes remembering, you know what, this is a tempest, but it's pretty contained and not as big a deal as maybe we make it out to be. But
timing is everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, I mean, circling back to it's great to explore our emotions, but just as we wrap up here, so often thinking or projecting the way we deal with anger, and that sort of, does God snap like I do when God's angry? Bringing that back, recognizing that's metaphor for a real experience that we have, but reminding ourselves that God's constant posture to us is nothing but unconditional love. And reminding ourselves, no, we don't need, God's not going to snap like me snapping, maybe saying some choice words to my dog, but yes. Anyway,
I'm so glad. Yes. I believe, anger, again, is an emotion like any other. The key word that stood out for me is vengeance. That's anger unchecked. That's anger out of control. Wrath, those are things you can feel, but what's the motivation on how we use those emotions? And we serve, and I believe in a God of love. That's always at the forefront of God's posture towards us. And God's identity and DNA is love. So it can't also be vengeance. So it's a beautiful text to take some time to explore. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. And whatever. Jesus on the cross is God in love refusing any harm to God's enemies, right? That's the sort of revelation we get there. We'll get more into, I think, our next conversation on how some of this ties into even maybe some contemporary events, but then I want to bring it back to our own lives as well. But fun exploring with you God's anger and what that looks like in our own lives, Grace. So thanks for journeying along with me.
Always a pleasure, Brad. Always a pleasure.
Wonderful. Till next time.
Till next time.
Yes.